Expanding Canada's oil and gas infrastructure has long been a contentious topic, but tough tariffs have forced the country to take a closer look at its sovereignty and self-reliance on its own resources.
2 to 4 United States dollars per million British thermal units in North America versus 10 to 20 United States dollars in Asia. That price gap is the oxygen of a new energy race. And Canada is building the pipeline import machine to capture it at scale, right as the trade war, climate, and tariffs politics make every cargo feel like a strategic weapon. For decades, Canada sold most of its natural gas south into the United States, trapped by geography and discounted by American shale competition. Now the map is changing. On the Pacific coast of Canada, liquefied natural gas export capacity is finally becoming real, powered by a single engineering fact: cool gas to minus 162 degrees Celsius, shrink its volume by roughly 600 times, and you can ship it across an ocean to the highest bidder. And here is the uncomfortable question for Washington. In a world of trade war tensions, retaliatory tariffs, and supply chain politics, what happens if Canada becomes the most efficient Pacific supplier while the United States is forced into longer, costlier routes? At the end of this report, I will lay out the one leverage point, the detail most commentators skip, that could quietly decide who wins this North American LNG contest. More than 670 kilometers of pipeline, more than 40 billion United States dollars in infrastructure investment, potential exports approaching 100 million tons of liquefied natural gas per year. When those numbers are placed side by side, the scale of Canada's energy transformation begins to look less like an industrial project and more like a strategic shift in global power. At the center of this transformation is the Montney Formation, a geological structure stretching across northeastern British Columbia and northwestern Alberta. Energy analysts estimate that the region may contain well over 400 trillion cubic feet of recoverable natural gas. To put that into perspective, that volume of gas could supply entire industrial economies for decades. Yet for years, much of this resource remained trapped inside North America because Canada lacked the export infrastructure needed to reach global markets. Now that constraint is disappearing. The Coastal GasLink pipeline alone runs approximately 670 kilometers from Dawson Creek to the Pacific coast at Kitimat. Once fully operational, it will deliver enormous volumes of gas from the Montney Basin directly into the LNG Canada liquefaction facility. Construction of this corridor has required thousands of workers, massive compressor stations, and billions of dollars in engineering and environmental planning. And the LNG Canada terminal itself represents one of the largest private energy investments in the history of the country. Phase 1 of the project is designed to export roughly 14 million tons of liquefied natural gas each year. But the second phase, which industry insiders believe is increasingly likely, could double that capacity, pushing total exports far beyond 28 million tons annually. But here is where the numbers become even more startling. One standard LNG carrier can transport roughly 170,000 cubic meters of liquefied gas. In gaseous form, that equals roughly 3 billion cubic feet of natural gas. At full operating capacity, a single large export terminal can load hundreds of these ships every year. Multiply that by several export facilities across the Pacific coast of Canada, and the result is a potential flow of energy worth tens of billions of dollars annually. And this expansion is happening at a moment when global LNG demand is exploding. International energy forecasts suggest that worldwide LNG consumption could rise by more than 70% before the year 2040. Much of that demand will come from Asia, where rapidly expanding cities and industrial zones require massive new electricity supplies. For Canada, this surge in demand represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity. For the United States, however, it raises a difficult strategic question. If Canada can ship energy across the Pacific faster and cheaper, could North America's balance of energy influence begin to tilt north? Because in the next part, the story moves beyond pipelines and terminals into a market so enormous that whoever controls it could reshape the global energy economy for the next quarter century. And there is one country at the center of that demand surge that almost nobody in Washington is fully prepared for. More than 1 billion new urban residents, electricity demand expected to double in several major economies, liquefied natural gas imports rising by tens of millions of tons each year. The scale of the Asian energy expansion is almost impossible to exaggerate, and it is precisely this surge that has turned Canada's LNG ambitions from a regional project into a global strategic play. Across Asia, economic growth continues to accelerate at a pace rarely seen in modern history. Manufacturing centers are expanding, data centers are multiplying, and hundreds of millions of households are moving into the middle class. Each step of this transformation requires electricity, industrial fuel, and reliable power generation. For decades, coal was the backbone of that energy system. It powered factories, heated cities, and drove industrial growth across the region. But coal also carries enormous environmental costs. Air pollution in major Asian cities has reached levels that forced governments to reconsider their energy strategies. As a result, many countries are now pursuing a transition toward cleaner fuels. Natural gas has become the centerpiece of that transition. Compared with coal, natural gas produces significantly fewer carbon emissions and far fewer particulate pollutants. It also provides reliable, on-demand electricity generation that renewable sources alone cannot yet guarantee. Because of these advantages, governments across Asia are expanding LNG import capacity at an unprecedented rate. Japan and South Korea remain among the largest LNG importers in the world. China has rapidly expanded its natural gas consumption over the past decade, building dozens of LNG receiving terminals along its coastline. But the country drawing the most attention from global energy exporters is India. India's energy trajectory could reshape the entire global LNG market. With a population exceeding 1,400 million people and an economy growing among the fastest in the world, India faces a staggering energy challenge. Electricity consumption is rising rapidly as industrial activity expands and millions of households gain access to modern appliances, air conditioning systems, and digital infrastructure. At present, India consumes roughly 65 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually. But government energy plans aim to dramatically increase that number over the coming decade. Officials in New Delhi have repeatedly stated their intention to raise natural gas to approximately 15% of the national energy mix by the year 2030. Today, that share is closer to 6%. Closing that gap will require an enormous increase in supply. Domestic gas production alone cannot satisfy India's growing demand. The country's reserves are limited relative to the scale of its energy consumption. As a result, India must look outward to secure long-term LNG contracts from reliable exporting nations capable of delivering massive volumes of fuel. This is where Canada enters the equation. Geography often determines winners and losers in energy trade, and Canada's western coastline provides one of the most important logistical advantages in the global LNG market. LNG carriers departing from the Pacific coast of Canada can reach major Asian import terminals significantly faster than shipments originating from the Gulf Coast of the United States. The difference in distance can translate into days of travel time and millions of dollars in transportation costs over the life of a supply contract. For example, an LNG shipment traveling from British Columbia across the Pacific Ocean can reach Japan or South Korea in roughly 8 to 10 days, depending on weather and shipping routes. By contrast, LNG cargoes departing from the Gulf Coast of the United States often require much longer journeys. Many must pass through the Panama Canal, a strategic choke point that has faced increasing congestion and water level limitations in recent years. When the canal experiences delays, vessels can wait days or even weeks before transit clearance. In extreme cases, ships are forced to reroute around the southern tip of South America, adding thousands of additional nautical miles to the journey. Every additional mile increases costs. Energy buyers paying billions of dollars for long-term LNG supply contracts carefully evaluate these logistics. Lower transportation costs translate directly into more competitive pricing and more reliable fuel deliveries for power plants and industrial facilities. This advantage places Canada in a remarkably strong position as global LNG demand accelerates. Industry forecasts suggest that worldwide LNG trade could expand dramatically over the next 2 decades. Some projections estimate that global demand may exceed 600 million tons annually by the year 2040. If Canada successfully completes multiple export terminals along its Pacific coast, it could capture a significant share of that market. Yet this expansion is unfolding within a broader environment shaped by economic competition, trade disputes, and tariffs policies that increasingly influence global energy flows. For decades, the United States dominated North American energy exports. The shale revolution transformed American production capacity, allowing the country to become one of the largest LNG exporters in the world. Massive export terminals in Texas and Louisiana now ship enormous volumes of liquefied natural gas to Europe and other regions. But the Pacific Energy Corridor emerging in Canada introduces a new competitive dynamic. If Canadian LNG can consistently reach Asian buyers faster and at lower cost, the balance of energy influence across North America could begin to shift. Energy markets are ultimately driven by economics, and buyers will always favor suppliers capable of delivering reliable fuel at the most competitive price. For policymakers in Washington, this raises difficult strategic questions. In a global environment already strained by trade war, tensions, and tariffs negotiations, energy supply routes can become powerful economic tools. Control the supply routes, and you influence the market. Lose those routes, and entire industries may feel the consequences. And that brings us to the next development that few people outside the energy industry are fully discussing. Because while Canada is building a Pacific Energy Gateway, leaders in the United States are now considering a massive response project, one so expensive and technically difficult that it could determine whether North America's energy leadership remains in Washington or quietly shifts north to Canada. And the projected cost of that response may shock you. For more than a decade, the United States has stood at the center of the global liquefied natural gas boom. The shale revolution transformed American energy production, turning the country into one of the largest natural gas producers in history. Massive export terminals along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana now ship enormous volumes of liquefied natural gas to markets around the world. In the year 2023 alone, the United States exported more than 90 million tons of liquefied natural gas, making it the largest LNG exporter on Earth. These exports became particularly critical for Europe after disruptions in global gas supply forced many countries to replace pipeline imports with seaborne LNG cargoes. But while the United States dominates Atlantic energy routes, geography creates a major limitation when competing in Asia. Most American LNG export terminals are located along the Gulf of Mexico. From these ports, cargo ships must travel thousands of additional nautical miles to reach Asian markets. Many of these shipments depend on the Panama Canal, one of the most important maritime choke points in global trade. The canal handles thousands of vessels each year, but it also faces physical limitations. Drought conditions in Central America have reduced water levels in the canal's reservoirs, forcing authorities to limit the number of ships that can transit each day. During peak congestion, vessels sometimes wait for days or even weeks to cross. For LNG cargoes, time equals money. Each additional day at sea increases shipping costs and delays fuel deliveries to power plants and industrial customers. Over the course of a 20-year supply contract, these logistical differences can translate into billions of dollars. This is precisely where Canada's Pacific export route becomes strategically powerful. LNG tankers leaving British Columbia do not need to pass through the Panama Canal. Instead, they cross the Pacific Ocean directly to Asian import terminals. The result is a shorter route, faster delivery times, and lower transportation costs. In global energy markets, that logistical advantage can determine which supplier wins long-term contracts. And this growing competition is beginning to capture the attention of policymakers in Washington. Faced with Canada's emerging Pacific Energy Corridor, the United States has begun revisiting one of the most ambitious energy infrastructure proposals in North American history, the Alaska LNG project. The concept behind Alaska LNG has existed for decades, but recent geopolitical developments have revived interest in the project. The plan involves constructing a massive pipeline stretching across Alaska from the gas fields of the North Slope to a liquefaction terminal on the southern coast. The pipeline alone would extend hundreds of miles across some of the most difficult terrain in North America. It would cross mountain ranges, frozen permafrost, and remote wilderness areas where existing infrastructure is extremely limited. Engineering challenges in these environments are enormous. Pipelines built across permafrost must account for ground movement, temperature fluctuations, and environmental protections. Construction costs rise rapidly when projects require remote transportation logistics, specialized equipment, and year-round environmental monitoring. Some cost estimates for the Alaska LNG project have reached more than 40 billion United States dollars, depending on final design specifications and pipeline routes. Financing such a project would require long-term commitments from energy companies, infrastructure investors, and potentially government participation. That is a massive financial risk. Meanwhile, Canada's LNG infrastructure is already moving toward completion. The Coastal GasLink pipeline is nearing operational readiness. The LNG Canada terminal in Kitimat is advancing through final construction phases. And additional LNG export projects are being proposed along the Pacific coast of British Columbia. The contrast between these timelines is significant. Canada's export system could begin shipping large volumes of liquefied natural gas years before any comparable Pacific infrastructure is built in the United States. In global commodity markets, being first can create enormous advantages. Long-term supply contracts often lock in deliveries for 15 to 25 years. Once those contracts are signed, switching suppliers becomes extremely difficult. That means the next few years could determine who captures the fastest growing LNG markets in Asia. If Canada secures major long-term agreements with countries such as Japan, South Korea, and India, the Pacific Energy Corridor emerging in British Columbia could become one of the most important supply routes in the world. And that development would not only affect energy markets, it could reshape the economic relationship between Canada and the United States, influence future tariffs negotiations, and add a new dimension to the broader trade war dynamics that already define global commerce. But there is another factor that could make this transformation even more powerful, a financial engine operating quietly behind the scenes. Because while governments debate policy and trade strategy, some of the largest investment funds on the planet are already placing enormous bets on Canada's LNG future. More than 60 billion United States dollars in energy infrastructure is now either under construction or in advanced planning across Western Canada. And financial analysts warn the total could approach 100 billion United States dollars if the next wave of liquefied natural gas projects is approved. This is not a routine industrial expansion. It is a financial surge that could redirect global energy investment away from traditional supply corridors and toward the Pacific coast of Canada. Behind this expansion stands one of the most powerful investment coalitions in modern infrastructure finance. Major multinational energy corporations, sovereign wealth funds, global infrastructure investors, and some of the largest pension funds on the planet are funneling capital into Canadian LNG projects. These investors are not betting on a short-cycle commodity boom. They are positioning themselves for decades of energy demand growth. Canadian pension funds alone manage more than 2 trillion United States dollars in assets, and a significant portion of that capital is increasingly targeting long-term energy infrastructure capable of generating predictable returns for 20 to 30 years. Pipelines, liquefaction terminals, and export ports fit that model perfectly because they operate under long-term supply contracts that guarantee steady revenue streams. Once operational, these assets can move energy worth tens of billions of dollars annually. The Montney gas basin feeding this export network is itself staggering in scale. Some geological assessments estimate that the formation contains more than 400 trillion cubic feet of recoverable natural gas. That volume represents enough fuel to supply major industrial economies for generations, and the mere existence of such reserves has drawn intense interest from global investors seeking stable, long-term energy supplies. But the financial momentum behind these projects is being amplified by a geopolitical reality that few policymakers openly discuss. As the global trade war environment intensifies and tariffs disputes reshape supply chains, energy security has become one of the most valuable commodities in international politics. Countries want suppliers that are politically stable, geographically reliable, and capable of delivering fuel without the risk of sudden export restrictions. Canada fits that description almost perfectly. It combines enormous natural resources with stable democratic institutions, predictable regulatory systems, and close economic ties to the United States while still maintaining independent trade relationships with Asia. For energy importers worried about geopolitical risk, this combination makes Canada an unusually attractive long-term partner. The ripple effects of this investment surge are already spreading across the Canadian economy. Construction firms are securing multi-billion-dollar contracts to build pipelines and export terminals. Engineering companies are designing cryogenic processing facilities capable of liquefying massive volumes of gas. Manufacturing industries are producing steel pipelines, turbines, compressors, and specialized equipment needed for LNG transportation. Local economies in British Columbia and Alberta are experiencing a surge in employment and infrastructure spending linked directly to these projects. Thousands of workers are involved in pipeline construction, terminal development, port expansion, and supporting industries that supply materials and logistics services. Entire regional economies are being reshaped by the emergence of a Pacific energy export corridor. Yet this economic transformation carries strategic implications that extend far beyond Canadian borders. As Canada's LNG export capacity grows, it could gradually reduce the country's dependence on selling natural gas to the United States. For decades, the majority of Canadian gas exports flowed south through pipelines into American markets, leaving Canada heavily tied to a single dominant buyer. Liquefied natural gas changes that equation completely. Once gas can be shipped across oceans, producers are no longer limited to regional markets. They can sell to whichever country offers the most competitive price, creating a far more flexible and globalized energy trade system. For the United States, this shift could introduce a new layer of competition at a time when global energy politics are already under pressure from tariffs, disputes, trade war tensions, and shifting geopolitical alliances. If Canada captures a significant share of Asian LNG demand, American exporters may face stronger competition for the fastest growing energy markets in the world. Energy markets rarely change overnight, but when they do shift, the consequences can be profound. Entire trade relationships, shipping routes, and investment flows can be redirected within a single decade. The construction cranes rising along the Pacific coast of Canada today may therefore represent more than infrastructure projects. They may represent the early stages of a new global energy order. And in the final part of this analysis, there is a deeper strategic question that few analysts are willing to address directly. Because if Canada truly becomes the Pacific gateway for North American energy exports, the balance of economic influence between Canada and the United States could begin to move in a direction that almost no one in Washington predicted 10 years ago. The implications of that possibility are far more disruptive than most people realize, and the final detail behind it may be the most controversial element of this entire energy transformation. More than 300 billion cubic meters of natural gas trade flows through global markets every year, and control over those flows has historically shaped geopolitical power. From the Middle East to Eastern Europe, energy supply routes have repeatedly determined diplomatic alliances, trade leverage, and even military strategy. Now, a similar shift may be quietly emerging in North America, and the numbers behind it are forcing policymakers to pay attention. For decades, Canada's energy exports depended heavily on the United States. Roughly 90% of Canadian natural gas exports historically flowed south through cross-border pipelines into American markets. This relationship created a stable energy partnership, but it also meant Canada had limited bargaining power in global energy pricing. If the United States was the primary buyer, American market prices effectively dictated the value of Canadian gas. Liquefied natural gas changes that equation entirely. Once gas can be cooled to minus 162 degrees Celsius and transported across oceans, it no longer belongs to a regional market. It becomes a global commodity. Canadian producers can sell their fuel to whichever country offers the most competitive long-term contracts, whether that buyer is Japan, South Korea, India, or emerging economies across Southeast Asia. This shift may sound technical, but the economic consequences could be enormous. If Canada eventually exports 100 million tons of liquefied natural gas annually, the revenue generated could reach tens of billions of United States dollars each year, depending on market prices. Over 2 decades of long-term supply contracts, the total value of those exports could approach or even exceed 1 trillion United States dollars. And that level of revenue would inevitably translate into influence. Energy exporting nations often gain diplomatic leverage because importing countries depend on stable fuel deliveries for their power plants, factories, and transportation networks. Reliable suppliers become long-term partners in trade negotiations, infrastructure development, and geopolitical cooperation. If Canada secures major LNG contracts across Asia, it could strengthen its economic ties with some of the fastest-growing economies in the world. But this is where the story becomes even more complex. The global energy system is not only shaped by supply and demand, it is also shaped by trade policy. Tariffs, disputes, and trade war tensions increasingly influence how countries choose their energy partners. Governments are becoming more cautious about relying on a single supplier, especially in industries as strategically important as energy. In that environment, diversification becomes a priority. Asian countries seeking energy security may prefer to balance their supply sources among several exporters, rather than depend heavily on any single country. That dynamic creates an opening for Canada. By offering large volumes of liquefied natural gas from a politically stable country with strong legal institutions, Canada could position itself as a reliable alternative supplier within a diversified global energy portfolio. For the United States, this emerging dynamic introduces a subtle but significant challenge. The United States remains one of the most powerful energy producers in the world. Its shale fields continue to generate enormous quantities of oil and natural gas. American LNG export terminals along the Gulf Coast remain among the largest and most technologically advanced in the global market. However, geography still matters. Canadian LNG shipments traveling directly across the Pacific may reach Asian markets faster and at lower transportation cost than shipments departing from the Gulf Coast. Over long-term supply contracts measured in millions of tons of LNG per year, even small differences in shipping efficiency can influence which supplier wins major deals. This does not mean the United States will lose its energy leadership. But it does mean that North America's energy map may become far more competitive in the coming decades. Instead of a single dominant exporter, the continent could develop 2 major LNG corridors. One in the Gulf of Mexico, serving Atlantic and European markets, and another along the Pacific coast of Canada, serving Asia. If that scenario unfolds, the global energy system would gain an entirely new supply route connecting the gas fields of Western Canada directly to the fastest-growing economies on Earth. And that is the part of the story that may surprise many observers. Because what we are witnessing is not simply the expansion of an industry. It is the construction of a new strategic gateway linking North American resources with Asian demand. Pipelines crossing mountains in British Columbia, liquefaction plants cooling gas to cryogenic temperatures, and LNG tankers crossing the Pacific are all pieces of a massive supply chain that did not exist at this scale only a decade ago. When that network reaches full capacity, the Pacific coast of Canada could become one of the most important energy export hubs in the world. And if that happens, the consequences will ripple through global markets, trade relationships, and geopolitical strategy in ways that few people are fully prepared for. Because the final question may be the most uncomfortable one of all. If Canada becomes the most efficient gateway for North American energy exports to Asia, will the United States respond by accelerating its own Pacific infrastructure? Or will it rely on its existing dominance and risk losing ground in the fastest growing energy market on the planet? That answer may determine not only who wins the next phase of global energy trade, but also how the balance of economic power across North America evolves over the next 25 years. More than 1 trillion United States dollars in potential long-term liquefied natural gas trade may now be tied to decisions being made along the Pacific coast of Canada, and the implications reach far beyond pipelines tankers, or energy companies. What is unfolding is a strategic economic shift that could reshape trade flows, investment patterns, and the balance of influence across North America for decades. Canada's LNG expansion is not simply about exporting gas. It represents a broader effort to diversify the country's trade relationships and reduce its historic dependence on selling energy almost exclusively to the United States. For generations, Canadian oil and gas flowed primarily south through pipelines into American markets, creating one of the most integrated energy partnerships in the world. That relationship remains strong, but liquefied natural gas introduces a new level of flexibility. Once Canadian gas can be transported across oceans, it becomes part of a global marketplace rather than a regional one. Producers can negotiate contracts with buyers across Asia, Europe, and potentially emerging markets that are still building their energy infrastructure. This flexibility strengthens Canada's negotiating position in international trade discussions and reduces the risks associated with relying on a single export destination. At the same time, the rise of Canada's Pacific Energy Corridor could introduce new dynamics into the broader trade war environment that has shaped global commerce in recent years. Tariffs disputes between major economies have already disrupted supply chains across manufacturing, technology, and agriculture. Energy markets are not immune to these pressures. Countries increasingly view fuel supply as a strategic asset rather than a purely commercial commodity. That shift makes stable suppliers extremely valuable. Canada's reputation for political stability, transparent regulation, and long-term contract reliability has already attracted billions of dollars in global investment. Energy companies and financial institutions are willing to commit massive capital to projects that can operate for 20 to 30 years under predictable legal frameworks. In a world where geopolitical tensions often threaten supply disruptions, that stability becomes a powerful competitive advantage. Yet the outcome of this transformation is far from predetermined. The United States remains one of the most powerful energy producers in history. Its shale fields continue to generate enormous volumes of natural gas, and its existing LNG export network along the Gulf Coast remains a dominant force in global energy trade. American energy companies also possess vast technical expertise and financial resources capable of building new infrastructure if market demand justifies the investment. The real question is timing. Energy infrastructure projects require years of planning, construction, and regulatory approval before they begin generating revenue. If Canada's LNG terminals begin exporting large volumes to Asia before competing Pacific projects in the United States are completed, long-term supply contracts may already be locked in with Asian buyers. These agreements often last 15 to 25 years, creating stable supply relationships that are difficult to disrupt once established. That means the next decade could be decisive. If Canada captures a large share of Asia's rapidly expanding LNG demand, the Pacific Energy Gateway emerging in British Columbia may become one of the most important export corridors in the global energy system. Ships carrying Canadian LNG could power factories in India, heat homes in Japan, and supply electricity to cities across Southeast Asia. The economic ripple effects would extend far beyond energy markets. Billions of dollars in export revenue could strengthen Canada's economy, create long-term employment across multiple industries, and deepen trade relationships with some of the fastest-growing markets in the world. Meanwhile, North America as a whole could become an even more influential supplier of energy to the global economy. But the strategic question remains open. Will Canada's LNG expansion simply complement the United States' energy dominance, creating a powerful North American export partnership serving both Atlantic and Pacific markets? Or could this transformation gradually shift some of the continent's energy influence northward, giving Canada a stronger voice in the global energy system than it has ever possessed before? That is the question policymakers, investors, and energy companies are now quietly debating, because the pipelines being laid across the mountains of British Columbia and the terminals rising along Canada's Pacific coast may ultimately represent more than infrastructure. They may represent the beginning of a new chapter in global energy trade. And as this story continues to unfold, the outcome may determine which nation holds the strongest position in one of the most critical industries of the 21st century. So the final question for viewers is simple. Is Canada building the next great energy gateway of the Pacific? Or will the United States respond with its own infrastructure surge and retain control of North America's energy leadership? Share your perspective in the comments below. And if you want more fact-based analysis on global trade, tariffs policy, and the economic forces reshaping international markets, subscribe to the channel for future reports. Thanks for watching.